There's a companion statement to the if statement called the else statement that makes our life a little easier while we're coding out decision making processes in C++. And it works a little something like this. Let's say that we have this integer number, right? And we'll say that number equals 5. And then we'll have this other integer called guess. And we'll prompt the user to guess the number, right? And then once they have entered in a guess, we will store that guess into that guess integer that we've created. And then we can launch into, say, an if statement here. We can say that if guess equals number. In other words, if they guessed correct, because, well, if they guessed 5 and the number's 5, well, then this is going to be a true statement here. And if the guess equals the number, then we're going to maybe see out to the screen that they were correct indeed, right? And then drop it down a line. Now, for every other possible scenario, like if they didn't guess 5, say if they guessed 6, all the way up to positive infinity. Well, that's incorrect. Guess would not equal number, and we'd have to do something else. Or if they guessed from 4 all the way down to negative infinity, any of those numbers, well, their guess would also not be correct, and we'd have to do something else, and that's where the else statement stands. Because, well, if the guess equals number, then we're going to do this. Well, we can enter in here the word else, and drop down, put a code block, and we can say that here's what we're going to do if this happens to be false up here. And so we're going to see out to the screen in that case that they were incorrect, right? And then maybe drop down a line. So you'll notice a couple of things here. That once again, there's no semicolon at the end of this line. It's just like the if statement. It gets none at the header. There's no parentheses with a test condition afterwards, because the test condition for the else statement is tied to the test condition of the if statement. Only one of these two code blocks is going to ever be executed in any running of this program. The number is either going to be correct, and this is going to print out to the screen, correct, or the number is going to be not correct. This is going to be a false condition, and then the else statement is going to execute saying that, well, they were incorrect this time. And so when we run this, we see that in practice it works just like in theory. So if we enter in a 4, they were incorrect. But if we entered in a 5, well, now we're correct. So that's how the else statement works in a nutshell. It's tied to the if statement above it. Normally when we have a bunch of if statements, they're all independent of each other, but this one is tied to the if statement above it. You can't just start off with an else statement, by the way. It has to have an if statement above it. You can't just out of nowhere be like, well, else we're gonna da 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 da. You need an if, and then whatever you're going to do for your if, and then the else follows the if, right? So you're not going to ever have an else without an if right before it, okay? You actually get errors if you were to try that. So good luck with that. Now, there's more to the story with the else statement, but it really comes out when there's a ton of different if statements involved. And so let's borrow an example that we've already gone over, but in the original if statement video, we had this egg scenario where we had prompted the user to say, enter the number of eggs they had in their refrigerator. And well, this was because there was this egg tray in a refrigerator that held exactly a dozen eggs, and well, we didn't want any more than a dozen, but at the same time, we didn't want to run out of eggs either. So we launched this whole if statement thing, where we're like, if, say, eggs was greater than 12, then we were going to see out to the screen that we had too many eggs, right? And then, well, if eggs was equal to 12, then the tray is exactly full. So maybe we print out to the screen that the tray is full in that scenario. But we didn't want to run out of eggs either. And we said that, well, if eggs was less than or equal to 3, then we were going to report to the screen that, well, we were running low on eggs in that particular scenario. And so this works exactly like you would expect. We ran this and we'll enter the number of eggs. And so 15, well, we have too many eggs in that scenario. And I'm kind of checking my code and showing proof of concept at the same time too. If we had 12, then eggs was full. And if we put in something like 2, then eggs were running low. But notice this here. So if eggs is greater than 12, well, that accounts for egg number 13 all the way up to positive infinity. And then we have another scenario for where if eggs equals 12. So with these two statements together, we're accounting for if we had 12 eggs all the way up to positive infinity, any number that you can come up with. And then if we had less than or equal to 3 eggs, so 3 down to negative infinity. But for 4 eggs, 5 eggs, all the way up to 11 eggs, there's nothing that happens here. If we were to run this and say have 8 eggs, you don't see anything print out to the screen. And if we wanted to have a message that says, well, maybe there's enough eggs, if you have like between 4 and 11 eggs, well, we could do that. We can say if eggs is then say greater than or equal to 4, right? And then after that, we can say that we can print to the screen that we have enough eggs, and then drop it down a line. Well, let's see this in action. When we run this, so enter in a number of eggs, let's hit that sweet spot. Let's say that we have 7 eggs in there, and so we have enough eggs. But for giggles, let's run it with, say, 12 eggs. And, well, 2 different messages pop up to the screen now. It says that the egg tray is full, but we also have enough eggs. And, well, the same thing should happen if we were to say put in 17 eggs. It says that we have too many eggs and enough eggs at the same time. And, well, this sort of makes sense because when we enter in a number like, say, 15 or whatever, well, 15 is greater than 12, so we have too many eggs. But 15 is also greater than or equal to 4, so we have enough. And the same thing happens when we enter in 12. 12 equals 12, so the tray is full, but also 12 is greater than or equal to 4, so we have enough. And that's why you see 2 different messages being displayed to the screen. Well, say in our scenario, we only want 1 message to be displayed to the screen at a given time, and that's where else steps back in. Only this time it's going to look a little different. This time, instead of just straight up else, it's going to be else if. Now, before we type these out, I want to point out something. These are 4 independent if statements. All of them, depending on their test condition, could be true. Not in this scenario, because you'll never have a number greater than 12 but also less than 3. But depending on what your test condition is in your program, you can have several if statements be true at the same time. And we did in this particular program. If we put in 15 eggs, well, 15 is greater than 12, but also 15 is greater than 4. You know, and so you can have several of these be true at the same time. Each of these are considered. All of them are sort of independent of each other. These are 4 separate if statements. Now, remember with the if else statement, they were no longer independent of each other. That was sort of all one block. If this one thing, else the other. And so that was all sort of one big block, and the same thing sort of happens when we use else if here. So if we said else if eggs equals 12, and else if eggs is greater than equal to 4, and once again, else if eggs is less than or equal to 3, what happens here is that only one of these scenarios is going to be executed. When it was only 2 scenarios, only one of the 2 was going to be if this, else that. Well, it's the same thing, only it's a chain of these things now. Only one of these is going to run, and whichever one is true first is the winner chicken dinner. And so let's say that we have 15 eggs that we entered in. So if eggs, if 15 is greater than 12, then too many is going to print out because, well, 15 is greater than 12. This is a true condition. And then the rest of these statements aren't even going to be considered. Even though 15 is greater than or equal to 4, we'll never know because we already had a true condition and that happens. And then, well, all of this is skipped afterwards. Now, if eggs equals 12, well, 12 is not less than 12. This is a false statement, so this is skipped over. But 12 does equal 12 here. It'll print out full, and then the last two else if statements will be skipped over entirely, not even considered. And so now when we run this, we should only get one scenario printing out. So remember before when we entered in 15, too many and enough printed out because 15 was greater than 12, but also 15 was greater than 4. And so both of those printed out, but this time just too many. And then, well, let's run these again. 12. Remember that it was full and enough, but this time it is just full. And so now these aren't four independent statements anymore. They're sort of considered all together. And you can even use an else at the end of this. Instead of saying else, eggs less than or equal to 3, technically here we could just say else. Because the way this one in particular works, well, if eggs is greater than 12, so once again, that's covering from 13 on up to infinity. If eggs equals 12, well, that's 12 on up to infinity covered now. Well, if eggs is greater than 4, well, now that's 4 on up to infinity. Else would cover every other scenario, but every other scenario is 3 and less, which is what we had here to begin with. So we don't even need an else if statement here. We can just use an else, and that works exactly the same. And so now let's just plug in A2, and you see that we are running low on eggs. So here is how you would use them all together: the ifs, the else ifs, and the elses. And so all together, this is decision making in C++. There is more on the topic, but this is the ifs and the else ifs and the elses pretty much covered. See you in the next one.